play Super Mario on the PS4! Woo!
Hello everyone and welcome back to a Critical Retrospective, and before you ask, that intro did mean something. I know it probably seems incredibly random, like I'm just forcing in a joke for no reason, but I promise it's actually really relevant to the issue at hand. Because this video is about Season 3. What do you think of Season 3? Probably really annoyed about how much potential they wasted. Probably really frustrated that they had so many good ideas that they flushed down the toilet. And probably most of all, confused as to how things got this bad in the first place. That's probably how you felt about this weird intro. Confused as to why Mario is on a PS4 game. Angry about how loud it was, and frustrated as to why I even did this to begin with. Well, I'll tell you why. It's to put you in the right state of mind. These Season 3 episodes in the last place segments of this video are so egregiously awful that I need everyone in my life to understand my pain. I spent countless hours working on this video, and so I need some validation knowing it wasn't in vain, have mercy. Don't get me wrong, there are some really good highlights in this season, but we won't be talking about those for a while. And while the highs of this season only really reach a certain threshold, the lows are just so disproportionately abominable. But you know what, I really wanted to get this ranking video out, because then I'll only have one season left to rank. Let's dive right in, for better or worse.
Disappointment in the game of life!
You know, there's something I've been wondering for a while. If people liked Stormy Weather so much, why isn't there a Stormy Weather 2? The answer is that there is, and it's a miserable disgrace. Look, I don't really know if anybody could possibly disagree with me on this, because this episode isn't really an episode, actually. The only new content we get takes up about half the episode, and the rest is cavalcaded with flashbacks that we don't need nor want. This episode is so boring, monotonous, and tepid that I'm more than willing to admit that this is my least rewatched episode in the entire show. The idea of Stormy Weather coming back and finally fighting the heroes once again is a pretty interesting idea, don't you think? After all, I'm pretty sure a lot of people liked the original Stormy Weather. Well, guess what? This fight between Stormy Weather, Ladybug, and Cat Noir is not only finished off screen, but isn't even given the screen time it deserves in the first place. I genuinely don't understand what the writers were thinking. Well, actually I do, because Thomas Astruc decided to take to Twitter and defend the episode like he always does. According to him, he says that this episode contains necessary flashbacks, but an unnecessary battle. And all I have to say to that in response is... what? What are you talking about? I genuinely don't understand how anybody could remotely come to that conclusion. These flashbacks are necessary? In what universe? Was it necessary to play the transformation sequences for Ladybug, Cat Noir, and their power-up forms? I don't think so. What about Rena Rouge and Carapace's transformations? All it did was add runtime to an already bloated episode. Fun fact, back in the day when this episode came out, somebody went through the trouble of editing this episode's flashbacks out and leaving us with the new footage that we got. And guess how long that video was? 11 minutes! Literally half of this episode's screen time is dedicated to recycled footage from previous episodes and previous seasons that we've already seen to death. Well, at least I've already seen to death. After all, I've been an absolutely hardcore fan of this show for 7 years at this point, who has watched every single episode multiple times. Maybe that's why this episode messes me up so much. And maybe that's also why I have very little to say about this episode. Because it's not really an episode, is it? Don't waste your time on Stormy Weather 2. You've seen half of it already.
Remember when you mistook me for a statue, Marinette? You kissed me.
What?
Not the Puppeteer 2. Everybody knows about that infamous wax statue scene that made people hate Marinette for generations to come. I remember it very well. As soon as you say The Puppeteer 2, everyone starts thinking about that stupid wax statue scene. And it really is as infamous and terrible as I remember it being back in the day. Marinette kissing Adrien when she thought he was a wax statue, taking one of his hairs from his head as his eye twitches. That very weird monologue that she was saying to herself as she did all of these things. It's all here. it in full display. It's insanity. It's just pure unbridled insanity and lunacy. But I think I'll just leave it there because I've got a video on Marinette coming up in about a month or so. And don't you worry, I'll definitely go into more detail about it there. The wax statue scene ruined this episode for me, and I have a feeling it ruined a bunch of other people's experiences with it too. This is why I almost never rewatch this episode, because when I'm having dinner and Miraculous is on the TV while I'm doing that, I don't want everyone around me to see Marinette almost kiss Adrien. I get secondhand embarrassment. So, is there anything else in this episode that could possibly salvage it? Well, not really. After all, this episode is focused entirely on the romance subplot that was always my least favourite part of the show. It's not what drew me in, as you probably already know if you watched my other videos. And Marinette is being really, really annoying and over the top in this episode. You know, the usual crazy faces, crazy poses, the whole works. When Hawkmoth finally showed up and graced me with his presence, I felt so relieved, like he was saving me from this nightmare. And the puppeteer battle was the only half-good thing in this episode. If I ever go to visit Paris in the future, I'm not going to the Grevin Museum. Too many memories. Moving on.
And you will be the most magnificent of guardians.
What?
What more can I say about Miracle Queen that I and many others haven't already said? It's one of the most underwhelming finales in the entire show, so I think I'll start talking about that before I get into the whole Chloe debacle. The final episode in Season 3. Well, it sure as heck doesn't seem like it. The whole fight takes place in this one random plaza. It feels like just a random fight against any other akumatized villain because of this. What I love about season finales normally is the fact that they're taken across so many different places. Seasons 2 and 4 understood this pretty well. They had really good scopes for their finales. And whether or not I'd want to admit it, the season 5 finale also had a relatively interesting scope. After all, the wish was made. Even though it was stupid, at least it was big. Miracle Queen doesn't understand this in the slightest. It definitely is stupid enough, but it sure as heck isn't big enough. I guess the idea of Miracle Queen mind controlling the entire city of Paris does have an interesting premise. What bothers me is that they don't do anything with it. Sure, all of Paris is mind controlled from Miracle Queen's wasps. However, most of them just stand still in one place. Only a few of the heroes actually get to do anything, and even then they don't do anything interesting. Miracle Queen is deakumatized after all of the heroes are incapacitated effortlessly. And once again, everyone is just standing around, talking to one another. They just kind of sort out their differences in their mind, and nobody takes advantage of anything or the confusion. It's just a large mess. And Chloe's redemption arc being thrown in the garbage and all of that, but what else is new? I've talked about that to death by now, I'm just tired. We all know it was a terrible story decision, let's just move on with our lives. I guess the only thing I have left to discuss is Master Fu's sacrifice, losing his memory, and leaving Paris. And yeah, it was pretty sad, but it didn't really lift up the episode in my eyes. After all, everything else was so terrible. The fact that this was the latest chronological episode of the show for a year and a half is sad. At least season 4 was able to pick up the pieces and create something actually worthy of discussion, right? Who am I kidding? Miracle Queen is just one of those timeless episodes, and not for the right reasons. The hype definitely did not outlive the hatred that we all felt for it. Moving on. To be perfectly honest, I was never a huge fan of Party Crasher, even back when it first aired. I mean, I can understand episodes that don't take themselves seriously, but this episode, it was kind of on another level in that regard. The ridiculous costumes, the crazy songs, the dancing, the singing, everything. This episode felt like a filler episode, even though it most definitely wasn't, considering the fact that it introduces a new hero in King Monkey. That makes this episode important and relevant, right? Well, not really. The problem I have with most of the heroes is the same for Kim in this episode too. It's just not been developed enough. He wasn't even that much of an important character this episode anyway. Marinette and Adrien, and heck, even Nino and Wayam have him beat. They have much more important roles this episode that actually feel like they matter in some respect instead of Kim's. All of those other characters get closure at the end of the episode, but Kim, nope. This was definitely when it started to feel like the new heroes were more of an obligation than actually doing something interesting. And that's not all. I really didn't like the whole Marinette sneaking into the party thing. It felt very weird. and all it did was fan the flames of the Marinette hatred and discourse that was going on. I guess Gabriel was kind of a saving grace for this episode. His monologues to his wife weren't quite so overdone back in these days, and I really appreciated them showing us how he harvested his butterflies and where he got them from. That's a nice touch. This episode isn't terrible by any means, but there's enough for me to dislike about it that means it can't really get any higher than it already is. Most of this episode fundamentally clashes with my personal tastes and desires, but I understand this is probably just a me problem, so if you like this episode, that's great. Let's move on now. Lyle episode. The first episode of Season 3, Chameleon, is definitely a controversial one if I do say so myself. After all, it brings back one of the most contentious characters in the entire show, Lila. She was gone for most of Season 2 until the Season 2 finale, but this is a Season 3 ranking video, so I should probably stay on topic. The thing that bothers me and most other people about this episode is the fact that Lila's lies are so incredulously obvious that nobody with half a brain cell should believe her. And yet, Marinette's classmates just eat it up completely, no questions asked, and it makes no sense. I mean, think about some of the lies that Lila tells in this episode. Her connections, quote unquote, with celebrities, saving Jaggedstone's lost kitten and all that, faking medical conditions and injuries. All of this should be incredibly easy to disprove, and yet nobody thinks to. Do you know why? Because Lila has plot armor. She's allowed to do whatever the writers want her to do just because it makes for an engaging story. And hey, it works. Whether I like it or not, I am engaged. I'm screaming at the screen for everybody to just grow a pair and realize that Lila's full of it. Sure, the story is engaging, but that doesn't make it good. After all, what I don't understand and never will understand in the entire world is the fact that this episode, despite being the season premiere, felt very low stakes. It's really poorly animated, and the fact of the matter is we spend most of the time in the school. It's more just domestic problems. After such a bombastic season 2 finale, you'd think they want to keep the momentum up at least for the first episode of the new season, right? Well, I guess not, because this season starts off very frustrating and rather boring. It's almost like this episode was a horrific omen for how season 3 would inevitably turn out. We should have heeded the warning early, guys. The only saving grace for this episode is Lila being kind of interesting as Chameleon. I mean, I've always loved shapeshifting characters in media, but that's pretty much all I can say about this episode in terms of quality. Everything else, don't bother watching it again, really. Just go watch Volpina again or something. Weredad is another one of those episodes that focuses on the love square, which means I must love it, right? Not really, you know this by now. I've never loved the Love Square episodes, yada yada, what else is new? I guess I should go into a bit more detail as to why this episode isn't exactly one of my favorites. The episode starts with a fight against Gigantitan, which, hooray, another recycled villain. Season 3 definitely needed more of those, right? Maybe if I do a 2-hour long Season 3 retrospective like I did with Season 4, I could go into more detail about it there, but right now, I'll just let it be a passing footnote. Then at the end of the battle, Marinette thinks that Cat Noir is onto her secret identity, and so to protect her secret, spontaneously says that she's in love with Cat Noir. Marinette's father takes this whole thing way too far and decides to set up a Sunday lunch with them. I guess it's kind of interesting to see the ways that he's trying to get Marinette with Cat Noir, but it gets kind of annoying after a while, to be honest. Sometimes this show has a nasty habit of dragging on jokes way longer than they should, and so the joke is no longer funny even if it initially was. So then Tom gets akumatized because Cat Noir rejected Marinette. And I will say, Weredad has a pretty interesting design and power set. He's pretty powerful, and he was able to trounce Cat Noir pretty easily. What it took for him to be defeated was to get his akumatized object destroyed somewhere else. He was literally about to take Cat Noir's Miraculous before Marinette got rid of the Rose. Plus, I will say, it was fairly interesting that the fight took place high up in the clouds. That's not something I see every day. The problem is, this part of the episode is very, very, very short. I swear, it's only about 4 minutes of the episode. Sure, these are just my personal preferences. I'm sure a bunch of other people really like this episode because of the Love Square drama. The problem is, for me, at the very least, that I was very much into the whole supervillain, superhero fights and everything, and so when they didn't last long enough, I get a bit annoyed. It is pretty subjective. Okay, let's admit, this is very subjective, but so is this whole video, so you know what, I guess it's fair. I don't really remember this episode all that much, which is why it's not exactly easy to talk about it. Same problem I have with the next episode. Of all of the episodes to have extraordinary animation, why did it have to be the one that I keep forgetting exists, genuinely? Let me just drop a little bit of lore about me. Sometimes when I'm bored, I just think about the episode orders for seasons 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. It depends on how I'm feeling in a day. I go through every single episode, for example, Chameleon, Animaestro, Bakerix, Backward or Reflect Doll, etc. I could even recite it all by heart, but you know what, that's not even the point I'm trying to make. I'm getting bogged down in details. The point is, I always forget to list this episode. And the thing is, that probably isn't fair. After all, this episode has a lot of presumably memorable things going on about it. A new akumatized villain, who is a new character who got akumatized for once, which doesn't happen that often in season 3, I'll admit. The whole toy thing is very funny. In fact, I rewatched this episode recently and really enjoyed it. Me and my brother both did. So why is it so low down on the list? Because, well, it's still pretty forgettable to me. It's pretty much the dictionary definition of a filler episode. Well, with it having absolutely no bearing on the overarching plot aside from introducing a new character, but really, just how important is Chris Laheef? Not very, I'm guessing. It's probably not really fair to rank it this low, but I'm just gonna do it anyway. It's my list and this is my YouTube channel. I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who love this episode, and you're not wrong for thinking that. This is just a me problem, you know? I would definitely recommend giving this episode a rewatch, because who knows, maybe your opinion will change if you don't like it. I'm keeping it in 20th place though. Guys, you don't understand. Thomas Astruc, nobody cares about him in this episode. The poor guy. Everyone thinks that he's a loser and no one knows who he is. It's not fair, you know? Okay, I can't pretend to feel sympathy anymore. Animaestro is not quite unbearable, but I definitely do get some ironic enjoyment from seeing Astruc's ego trip in full display. I mean, nobody in this episode knows who he is. He's constantly downtrodden, never gets what he wants, everything goes wrong for him. He talks to people about animation and nobody understands what his role in the animated movie was. Which, yeah, I can sympathize there at the very least. It can be frustrating if nobody understands how you participated in your own fictional work. But the thing about this episode that I and many people have noticed is that it feels like Astruc is kind of blowing off steam with this episode. It feels like that the people he interacts with are kind of stand-ins for the fan discussions he has with people on Twitter where people kind of demean him a bit. Or heck, just have valid criticism for the show. Never mind the fact that he's treating perfectly reasonable people very poorly. And I'm not talking about the whiny haters, he can block those people all he wants. We all know what I'm talking about, we all saw this video. Let's try and focus on the actual episode instead of Astruc himself. As Animaestro, he keeps going on about how everyone will be looking at him, which... subtle, guys. Subtle. And then at the end of the episode, Astruc lets Marinette watch the movie in his place, to which Marinette exclaims, "Oh my goodness, you're Thomas Astruc, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." And yes, this is supposed to be a wholesome moment, but it's ruined by the fact that it's so painfully obvious what this really is. It feels like Marinette didn't really care about Astruc at all, because she probably saw him at least in the corner of her eye earlier in the episode and yet said and did nothing. It felt like she was just stroking his ego. In fact, this whole episode felt like a giant ego trip for Astruc, which I've already mentioned. It felt like they really wanted to portray the real Astruc as somebody who nobody understood and who didn't deserve all of the criticism and ridicule that he was getting. Hawkmoth literally calls him the behind-the-scenes creator who never gets any of the credit, despite the fact that Astruc is basically the face of the brand at this point. This episode isn't that bad, it's just kind of annoying to sit through based on what we know about the actual creator of the show. The actual target audience probably won't care about this. Moving on. Heart Hunter, the first half of the awful finale for Season 3, isn't nearly as bad as the second half if you ask me. And the thing is, this isn't isolated to just Season 3, it's the same thing with Season 5, as you'd know if you watched my Season 5 ranking video back in November. I feel like the setups are always a lot better than the payoffs, because we don't really get to see the full idea unfold before itself, especially considering the fact that the ideas that we do see in the second half are almost always terrible. But what does that really say about the whole two-parter when you take it as an aggregation? Ultimately, the writers want you to see these stories that they've crafted, and why do I feel like it's better when they don't? Because, well, the story they crafted isn't good. Heart Hunter is also very problematic to me. However, I don't have nearly as many problems with it as the previous episodes I've talked about. And to be honest, it's definitely more of a me problem, considering the fact that I don't care too much about the romance side of things in the show, which you all know about. I'm not going to repeat myself there, you're getting tired of it. Honestly, I just don't really care too much about the the whole, oh, Marinette is jealous of Kagami being with Adrien and stuff, but what I do like is the friendship that they have. Ever since Hikari Gozen, Kagami's become a much more interesting character. She used to be quite a cold Ice Queen type character that I never really related to, but now she's actually getting a bit more depth. I really appreciate seeing Kagami actually genuinely being happy with Adrien, and all of them having fun together for the first time in a long time, considering how strict their parents are with them. However, the episode also relies very heavily on the romance. Marinette and Adrien and Luca and Kagami and all of these intertwining relationships that are very difficult to keep track of, and yet somehow everybody tries because I know that other people find it interesting. They have different preferences to me, and that's okay. Just because I don't see worth in this kind of story doesn't mean other people won't. Moving on. I don't really care too much for Desperada actually, and some parts of it were kind of—
Objection!
It's been a while since I've seen you, hasn't it? But you know what, I'm guessing that at least a sizable portion of my audience wants answers too, so I might as well not ignore you this time. The main problem I have with Desperada is how Marinette treats Adrien and the fact that she puts him on a pedestal a lot, and it's very annoying to watch. A sizable portion of the episode is dedicated to Adrien being really bad as the Snake Miraculous holder, and yet Ladybug still showers him with affection and praise. It's like Marinette is incapable of seeing Adrien's actions in an imperfect light. It almost muddies the waters around her affection for him. Does she actually like him for the real him, or just the image she has in her head? Now this is a pretty interesting idea that maybe they could explore in this episode, make Marinette realize that she's been putting Adrien on a pedestal and deserves to see him for an actual human being. So, do they actually address this? Well, I guess kind of. Towards the end of the episode, Adrien relinquishes the Snake Miraculous, telling Ladybug that he didn't do a good job with it. But then Ladybug says, oh no, you were perfect, I must have done something wrong. This is confusing to me, because they're kind of trying to address the issue, and yet not going all the way with it like they probably should. However, the episode does pick up later when Luca becomes Viperion, who is a far superior Snake Miraculous holder in almost every way conceivable. Plus, I also quite appreciate that they're getting straight to the action this time. Desperada shows up about 4 minutes into the episode, and you know that the action is my favourite part, so clearly this episode has a lot of promise. It's just too bad that the middle of this episode kind of lets it down on a rewatch. This is super random, but I have a very specific memory regarding Bakerix. At some point during like 2021 or something, I got up really early in the morning, about 6 AM, and I put Bakerix on while I performed my daily activities. I know, it's not that special, but I thought you'd want to hear it. Plus, I can prove that this is relevant to the section at hand. This episode is pretty good, it's light fun, and it doesn't really overstay its welcome or try to do anything too unique or interesting, which could be a detriment. However, this episode manages to pull it off, considering the fact that the problems of this episode are fairly domestic. Marinette's grandfather refuses to actually be present in their lives, and so for Tom's birthday, Marinette decides to try and make them reconcile. There's no grand evil scheme from Hawkmoth puppeteering everything from behind the scenes that Marinette/Ladybug needs to avoid in order to save all their friends and family from complete and utter doom at the hands of Hawkmoth. Just Marinette trying to repair her familial ties. And so it becomes a lot easier to empathize with the characters and their struggles because you relate to it more, because this kind of thing happens in daily life a lot for a lot of different people. So why is it rather low considering how highly I'm praising it? Well, it has to do with that little story at the start of this section. When you wake up at like 6 AM, you still tend to be pretty groggy and tired. And so I don't really have the time to truly appreciate the things around me as well as I do when I'm completely awake and aware. And that's kind of what my problem is with this episode. It's just kind of boring sometimes. That does seem completely contradictory to everything I've been going on about, but you know what, I'm pretty sure I can explain. I have been extrapolating meaning from this episode, doing deep field analysis of what it could mean or what it does actually try to say. The actual episode is a lot less subtle than this, considering how much of a caricature Roland is. He's very exaggerated and over the top, and kind of downright unreasonable in a lot of areas. Walking on his own son because he put rice in the dough that they were making, it's probably a metaphor for something, but I'd prefer if they actually just said it outright. Anyway, let's move on now. What do Star Train and Qilin both have in common? They both have abhorrent animation, jeez! I mean, the lighting and texture work is all off. It creates an uncanny valley vibe to this episode. If you sat somebody down who had nothing to do with the Miraculous fandom and never saw a single episode before this one, they never would have guessed that this was from a multi-million-dollar franchise. But you know what, I should probably just stop ranting about this because it's not why I put this episode in this place. Or at the very least, not completely the reason. Because I found this episode a bit more enjoyable than Bakerix considering how relatively high the stakes were. Seeing Marinette and her friends try and cope with space is a very interesting concept that they haven't explored in the show before. And so I'm relatively intrigued, and my attention span is actually focused on the episode instead of everything else surrounding it, considering how bad the show can be sometimes. However, it's kind of fleeting considering the fact that this episode still doesn't necessarily go as far as the other episodes did. I mean, it does introduce Max as the Horse Miraculous holder, however it still doesn't feel earned for all of the reasons I brought up in my Season 4 video about the new heroes. I feel like if Max got a little bit more development before he became a hero, just like Chloe, Alia, and Nino did, maybe I would have accepted it. Who knows? I will also say, this episode did make Chloe relatively entertaining. Her conveniently forgetting that Ladybug said she couldn't be Queen Bee anymore in Miracula is a bit of a problem, but it doesn't really affect this episode too much considering how minor it is. Plus I found it relatively entertaining to see her trying to do good deeds and yet it was for selfish intent. Kinda makes me wonder if this whole Miracle Queen fiasco was actually planned from the first place. This does definitely provide evidence to that, so I guess I should delete my Chloe video. I'm obviously joking, there's no way I'm getting rid of that video considering the fact that it got 40,000 views. Plus it's not like anything in that video was explicitly wrong. Overall, I have problems with this episode, but that doesn't stop it from being relatively enjoyable. And it does have a fairly unique premise, just like the next episode on this ranking. As an episode, I feel like Oblivio is one that people are very mixed on. Some people love it to pieces and other people hate it to pieces as far as I know. So where do I stand on this? Well, in my humble opinion, I feel like this episode has a lot going for it, but also a lot going against it. Let's start with the positives first though. I will say that this episode has a really unique premise. It's starting with Ladybug and Cat Noir already in the middle of the action and trying to piece together what's going on. When normally we have to do the setup and the civilian side of things and then somebody gets akumatized and all that. However, this episode starts off straight away, there's no nonsense, we know what we're getting into, and yet we also really don't, because something about this episode is different to the rest. And I'll tell you what that is, Marinette and Adrien lost their memories. And I will say, it's very interesting to see Marinette and Adrien rediscover who they are, not bound by the limitations surrounded by their memories. Plus, Oblivio as a villain is very intimidating and cool, especially considering the fact that we didn't know who they were at the start because they were this unseen force. It does become a bit obvious who they are as soon as they open their mouth, considering the fact that they're just the combined voices of Nino and Alia. But that also raises the question, how was Hawkmoth able to akumatize two people into one entity? It's really creepy. How does that even work? What are Nino and Alia's perspectives on that? You know what, we're never gonna get an answer, so I'm just gonna shut up. The problems with this episode are numerous. It's very heavily focused on the romance, which I've already stated many times before that I didn't care about nor even like that much. However, there is also a bigger problem at play. This episode is just bait. It's just leading the fans with a carrot on a stick, promising greatness but then ripping it away from them at the last second. And while I personally don't care too much, I sympathize with the people who do. This is season 3. Surely we could get some character development from our leads by this point, right? This episode more than anything represents the show's insistence that the status quo must always remain the same. However, unlike this episode and the show at large, I want to avoid repeating myself endlessly, so how about we move on now? Another Lila episode. To be honest, I actually rather enjoyed Oni-chan. A lot more than I thought I would, considering the fact that it's another Lila episode, which I've already alluded to. But the difference is, Lila's lies aren't completely and utterly, humongously outrageous this time. They're only just kind of outrageous. This episode focuses on Lila trying to get closer to Adrien by kind of infiltrating his house using her deceptive methods. And it was definitely a lot smarter than she normally is. She isn't telling absolutely brazen lies as much as she was in Chameleon. Don't get me wrong, she still does it. The start of this episode is very clearly an example of that. However, she's a lot more subtle with it now. For example, she asks Adrien what the lowest grade he ever got was, and then uses this information to bait Natalie into letting her into the Agreste mansion, promising that she can help get get Adrian's grades up. That's actually really clever. I'll give Lila credit there. If only she was always this clever at her deceptions. Oh well, we can't win them all, I guess. I'll take what I can get. Anyway, here's a problem I have with the episode. I feel like Kagami getting akumatized didn't get nearly as much build-up as it probably should have. I mean, she's the main villain of this whole episode. Surely you could have spared a bit of the Lila screen time to her. Plus, this was before Kagami's character development and her becoming a much more interesting character in Ikari Gozen. And so, Oni-chan as a villain is very one-dimensional. She just wants Lila away from Adrian and will stop at nothing to achieve this goal. I will give them this though, at least they didn't akumatize Kagami into Riposte again and actually made her a new villain. If you're gonna reuse villains, you might as well put the effort in, so I commend them for that. Furthermore, Marinette's behavior in this episode is just quite problematic, trying to sneak into Adrian's house again, but I feel like I'll just save that for my Marinette video that's coming out in about a month or two. You're going to hear a lot about my problems with Marinette in that video, so stay tuned. Furthermore, I find it really weird and rather convenient that Gabriel just completely forgot about Lila and how much he probably meant to her. I mean, she gets willingly akumatized so many times, you'd think you'd offer a little bit more leeway, but you know what, you do you, I guess. Besides, it's all there in my Gabriel video. Overall, I found this episode relatively enjoyable, and I know I say that a lot, but that's because it's true. I mean, this is one of the more tolerable Lila episodes, and that in and of itself is an extraordinary achievement. Moving on. Gamer 2.0 is one of the few episodes of the show where I don't really mind them reusing a previous antagonist. After all, Gamer's second appearance in this episode, Gamer 2.0, is actually fairly unique and different from his first appearance in Season 1. In his debut episode, he had a giant robot that he could level up by absorbing people's energy. Then at the end of the episode, he, Ladybug, and Cat Noir had a pretty interesting Street Fighter style fight. However, it didn't really feel like it appealed to my specific gaming tastes. I'm definitely more of a Nintendo guy myself, and so Street Fighter doesn't really hit me the same way it probably does a bunch of other people. However, this episode kind of makes up for that. It feels like it was designed and appealed to me specifically. To be honest, I really love Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. It's one of my favorite Nintendo Switch games, and probably games of all time. It isn't my favorite, Tears of the Kingdom says hi. However, it doesn't take away from the fact that this episode gives me the fan service I did not know I needed. Gamer 2.0 creating a fighting game Super Smash Bros. Style with akumatized villains is just such a good idea. Didn't Astric and Co say that if there was enough hype and support behind it, they would make this an actual game? I would definitely actually buy that instead of Rise of the Sphinx and whatever the stupid sequel is now. Plus, this episode teaches a very important lesson about learning to take breaks in between important duties and tasks, not just letting yourself get burnt out. I really needed to hear that back when this episode came out. So, what are my problems with this episode? Well, they're kind of generic, but this episode is pretty much just filler, and it doesn't really have nearly as much going for it as the episodes I'm going to talk about soon. I mean, it's generic fan fun, but that's really all it is at the end of the day. Plus, the animation in this episode is not great. I understand it was DQ Animation animating this episode, and they didn't have that much experience back in these days. And it's definitely not Star Train or Chi-Lin levels of bad animation.
I wouldn't even make a joke about that. That's going too far.
But it is a little bit off-putting how stale and lifeless everything looks. And this episode mainly only really appeals to people who are enthusiastic about video games. But what it does to try and please these people, it does very, very well. Backwater was the first episode in Season 3 that felt very lore and story heavy. And come to think of it, I feel like it would have fared better as episode 1 of this season instead of Chameleon. I mean, seriously, doesn't this episode feel more like a premiere than the actual one does? Or is it just me? Chameleon could have been any episode this season, just probably not the one right before the finale. I really enjoyed learning more about Master Fu's past. He's always been a bit of an enigmatic figure in the lives of Marinette and Adrian, heck, especially with Adrian. Poor guy doesn't even get one single mentoring session with Master Fu on screen completely. But this fleshes out Master Fu in a way that I never really considered before, giving him a love interest of all things. And I will say, the moment when Marianne thinks that Master Fu doesn't love her anymore was really heartbreaking. You know, because she's super old and I don't like seeing old people upset, it just hurts me. However, I do feel like Backwater's design was really weird looking. The mask with the mouth hole is just not a very appealing look. Who designed that thing, honestly? But that's besides the point. After all, all, this episode isn't this high for no reason. It's this high because of the pretty good lore revelations it gives the viewers. You know me, I'm all about the overarching story in this show, yeah. But I can't really help myself. I mean, isn't that what every good show needs? Well, not necessarily, but most shows that I like definitely have this aspect in there. Through Backwater's revelations, Hawkmoth realizes that the Guardian of the Miraculous is somewhere in Paris. And this is really huge. Master Fu's always been hiding in secret, able to give orders to Ladybug and Cat Noir from a safe distance away from any danger. And while the wall isn't completely broken, so to speak, there are definitely cracks in there. Cracks that could definitely open in a future episode, which they do in the episode Feast, but I'm going to talk about that when I talk about that. Since this is only episode 4, they don't do anything notoriously dramatic or anything like that, but what they do is actually enough. We don't need to do something crazy right this early in the season, just something to build up expectations for the future. Moving on. Felix's debut episode was a very controversial one to say the least, but I mostly liked it. Sure, there are reused villains that make things kind of boring in the second half. Sure, Felix's character in this episode isn't completely congruent with everything he does after this. Sure, the animation isn't the best, but you know what? I still like it. There's still enough here that I can grasp onto with a positive response. So let's start with Felix. After all, he is the titular character in this episode. The best part about Felix in this episode is how mysterious and intriguing he is. When he first shows up, he just seems like a typical bratty kid who wants to take out his anger on his cousin. But we do get some layers there, and those layers are very important. He seems angry at Adrien for not attending his father's funeral at Gabriel's request. Granted, this was before we realized that Felix's father was a piece of garbage, but you know what? At this time, we'll take what we can get. Plus, the rivalry that he had with Gabriel was really interesting to watch. It feels like that at this point in the show, most of the villains were allied together and seemed pretty friendly with one another. Felix was the wild card in that scenario. He actually despises Gabriel for reasons that we wouldn't really get until season 4 and 5. You see what just happened? That's it right there. The fact that not all of the questions were answered in this single episode is why I love it so much. Leaving intrigue and suspense for later episodes to come is definitely one of the things that I wanted Miraculous to do for a long time, and I will say the Graham de Vanilli twin rings foreshadowing was really strong here. It would be 2 seasons before we figured out what they truly were about, and so we had plenty of time to theorize and come up with that Adrien is a senti-monster theory. I was really into that theory back in the day, honestly. I remember being 14 years old, reading through forum posts about why Adrien is actually a senti-monster and why Felix is one too, and all of the foreshadowing and clues that we were getting throughout the episodes. I'm pretty sure it started with this episode and the episode Ladybug. The impact these 2 episodes left on the fandom cannot be understated. And to me, that's how you know you've made a good episode, if it impacts a lot of people all at once, and creates a positive ripple effect for months and years to come. Granted, the reverse is also true, but let's not worry about that, shall we?
There's no Miracle Queen.
Traveling through time. No, he's not.
Time Tagger is very thrilling, but also very confusing. There are quite a few lines spoken by some of the characters that just makes me scratch my head. But you know what? Maybe that's a good thing. After all, it's keeping me engaged, trying to figure out what the heck is going on. So, what the heck is going on? Well, I'll tell you. A supervillain from the future comes to attack Ladybug and Cat Noir and steal their Miraculouses. Which, honestly, is a very intriguing idea that I probably wouldn't have thought of because I lack imagination. Just joking. I'm also surprisingly okay with the Mr. Pigeon reappearance in this episode, since it didn't really get too stale yet until season 4. After all, this is a pretty funny scene where Ladybug and Cat Noir just go through the motions trying to defeat the pathetic Mr. Pigeon, before the stakes are immediately raised when Time Tagger shows up. I don't really understand what he's doing with the whole graffiti around all over the place. They say he's traveling through time, but to me it just looks like he's teleporting. But that shows how much I know about time travel. So somebody elucidate me in the comments, please. I really liked seeing future Alex come back to the past to try and help Ladybug and Cat Noir defeat Time Tagger. Sure, the Rabbit Miraculous is ridiculously overpowered, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't fun to see utilized. Seeing Bunnix and Time Tagger fight each other through different time periods was very interesting to watch, and I really enjoyed it. Anyway, let's get to the actual part of the episode that made me put it on this spot. Towards the end, Time Tagger reveals that Hawkmoth in the future is not Gabriel, and this sends Hawkmoth into a bit of an existential crisis, as I guess he assumed that he would succeed in his goal eventually, but if he's succeeded by somebody else, that either means that he's failed or he succeeded, which Natalie reminds him of. I also find it really funny that at the time that this episode aired, almost everybody immediately jumped on the Lila is the future Hawkmoth theory. I mean, Lila is at the end of this episode. Why? I don't know. Maybe it's foreshadowing. And it turns out, just like the Senti-Monster theory, we were right on the money. Lila is the new Hawkmoth, and I'm definitely looking forward to talking about her new role in Season 6 whenever that rolls around. So thank you, Time Tiger. Thank you for being a great episode with great foreshadowing. You know, I actually really liked Reflectdoll. How long has it been since I last saw it again?
5 years?
5 years?
Wow, that makes me feel old. But you know what, let's just not think about that anymore. I love this episode actually, but it's probably just not fair for me to put it higher than this. While there are interesting things in this episode, they're not as interesting as the things that I'm going to talk about pretty soon, but I will gush about this episode for as long as I'm permitted. This was the first episode where someone was akumatized and amokized at the same time, and it was very cool to see. Seeing Mayura return after about 4 or 5 episodes without her was very lovely as well. I always thought Mayura didn't get enough representation in Season 3, and so this was an opportunity for her to actually show what makes her different from Hawkmoth and how she complements him. This also has a good example of a villain being reused, because it adds something new to the table. This was only Reflector's second appearance, so I was a lot more charitable with her appearance in this episode. Besides, she has a new Sentimonster as well. Reflector having a giant Sentimonster Reflectdoll that she can control at her very whim is very cool. Plus, it means that the stakes are raised, because capturing the Akuma won't be enough to defeat the villains, because you need to capture the Amok as well. However, the arguably most important part of this episode is the fact that the Kwamis were swapped. I adored seeing how Marinette and Adrien got accustomed to each other's miraculouses. It was something that we weren't used to, so it made the Reflectdoll battle all the more interesting to watch. Plus, I was just happy for this episode to finally be released at all after how much teasing it got in the months leading up to it. I remember a bunch of people thinking it was going to be released on the 8th of August, which I thought so too, but then Gloob, the Brazilian YouTube channel, struck again and baited us into something we didn't even want. Which, come on Gloob, that's not cool. If anyone was there during that whole fiasco, feel free to let me know in the comments. Overall, I really love this episode and what it does for the show at large to shake things up, even if it was just for one episode. Moving on. Kwami Buster is just one of those episodes that I feel like is one of the most important in the whole season. This ain't no Stormy Weather 2, things actually happen and they're actually really important. Miss Mendeleev, a character who I never really batted an eye about before, is actually really integral to the Kwami plotline of all things. It's not something I personally would have thought of, but you know what, they do a pretty good job handling it in this episode. Miss Mendeleev actually trying to catch the Kwamis and then going onto a TV show to prove their existence to the world. Really scaring Marinette and Adrien in the process, considering the fact that they work really hard to keep their identities a secret. This leads to a scene that probably gets me more emotional than it really has any right to. Marinette saying that she doesn't know whether or not Tiki will tell the truth to her from this point onwards, and then Tiki sadly apologizing. It's just so sad. Anyway, focus. Kwami Buster has the power to capture Kwamis, which is definitely one of those things that raises the stakes in a very meaningful and elaborate way, because it meant that Marinette now has to take some different miraculouses and use them to her advantage to defeat Kwami Buster and save Cat Noir. I really enjoyed Multimouse as a superhero and seeing her team up with all the other Multimouse clones to defeat Kwami Buster and successfully trick Cat Noir into thinking Marinette isn't Ladybug. I will say I was getting a little bit confused at the plan towards the end of the episode when I first watched it, but after a few rewatches it finally stuck with me. This is a bit of a tangent, but I find it really funny that of all the people to remotely criticize Miss Mendeleev's findings, it was Chloe and Max. You know, two of the people who actually got Kwamis and saw them in the flesh and saw what they do. But you know what, that doesn't really matter, does it? Also, we got some new lore revelations, which you all know by this point I'm into. Learning about the fact that not only can you fuse miraculouses, but too much of that fusion will cause you to lose your mind. But why wasn't this used in Miracle Queen, where Chloe wears too many miraculouses and then she becomes the ultimate losing her mind Miracle Queen? I will never understand. Just another nail in the coffin for that awful Season 3 finale. At least we get episodes like this towards the middle that make me forget. Moving on. I kind of considered swapping Kwami Buster and Silence's places in the list, but you know what, I feel like I should just stick to my guns at this point and explain why I like this episode so much. First of all, back in Captain Hardrock and Froza, Luca was a bit of a flat character who only really existed to be an alternate love interest for Marinette. But then in this episode, he actually gets some depth. He's normally really calm and serene, and don't get me wrong, I do like that in characters, but I'd also like to see some range. And we do get that in this episode thanks to that slimy producer Bob Roth, who I just love to hate. Luca actually Kagami gets really angry at him, and it's really quite terrifying to see such a calm person get angry for the first time. It makes him feel like more of a person rather than just a plot device. And Luca is definitely the star of the show in this episode. Him as Silencer is a very terrifying villain. What with the fact that he only really speaks through other people's voices that he stole, plus his relentless pursuit of Bob Roth to make him pay for what he did to his friends. I really appreciate that the akumatization was fairly early in the episode, so we had lots of time to really appreciate the action. When the fights are too short, it's kind of annoying for me because this is the best part of the show in my opinion, so I really appreciate it when they give it the time to flesh itself out. Plus, for once, the animation is actually really good. The motions of the characters, the lighting, the textures, everything. It makes it feel so much more alive than it would have if DQ or Symbiosis was animating it. And I feel like that's one of the major contributors for why I loved this episode so much. I mean, I talk about good animation a lot, but I really feel like it was a lot better in this episode than it normally is with the other SAMG animated episodes, weirdly. Plus, the revelation that Luca actually reciprocates Marinette's feelings for him. It's not something I would have expected, but it makes pretty good sense. And it also contrasts him with Adrian even further, because this was back in the she's just a friend phase of the show. Anyway, we're closing in on the top 5 now. I know, exciting. And I'm just as excited as you are, so let's move on. You know, if there's one thing Miraculous needs more of, it's more Haru Kagami. Of course, I was gonna say Kagami the whole time. On an unrelated note, listen to this phenomenal voice acting. Okay, back on track. I've kind of been foreshadowing Ikari Gozen's place in this list for a while when I talk about how Kagami gets a lot better in this episode, and honestly, she really does. We already saw inferences that Kagami's mother was really strict with her and wouldn't let her spend much time doing recreational activities, but we really get to see it here. She's very cold and distant with her daughter and doesn't really let her do anything to express herself in any meaningful way besides fencing, I suppose. Plus, Kagami just leads a very lonely life. She doesn't have any friends besides Adrian, and even then Kagami admits that it isn't the same. Probably because Kagami didn't really make friends with Adrian on her own terms. It's just because Gabriel was a very powerful businessman. And then we see her bond with Marinette and really try to be her friend. That scene in the middle of the episode where Kagami is reading prompts from her phone to try and make friends with Marinette while smiling awkwardly was really heartbreaking but also really funny. It was funny at the time because we didn't really know what the context surrounding it was, but then later in the episode we realized Kagami was trying to be Marinette's friend. And this develops Kagami's character in the same way Silencer did for Luca. She isn't just the alternate love interest anymore, she has goals and aspirations beyond that. And it makes her into more of a real person, just like Silencer did for Luca. Plus, the fight against Ikari Gozen, Ladybug, Cat Noir and Ryuko was very interesting to watch and I really loved it. Is it Ryuko or Ryuko? I don't really know. Forgive me if I mispronounced it. Either way, I really liked how Kagami seemed to have actually earned her Miraculous in this episode, considering the character development she undergoed even in spite of it. It doesn't feel like Kagami got all of this depth all of a sudden just because they needed to fill out a Miraculous slot. This time it's the other way around. The Miraculous complements the character's already existing development. And since that doesn't really happen a lot, especially in season 3, it more than deserves this spot on the list. Moving on. You get the drill by now. Ladybug does something that no other episode in season 3, not even the finale, managed to do, and that's cramming so much cool stuff into just 20 minutes. I mean, sure, the episode doesn't start out that great what with Lila's nonsensical plan, but it doesn't really affect my enjoyment of the episode too much because of all the other cool stuff that it does to make up for this plot hole. What with Marinette's class, including Marinette herself, becoming akumatized by Scarlet Moth. Also, yeah, Scarlet Moth returns. Heroes Day was still one of the best finales in the entire franchise, and I'm so glad to see it get a callback here. Even if it was just a fake out, it was a really cool idea to have Marinette almost get akumatized. I mean, it raises the stakes so massively. But then the episode kind of takes a little bit of downtime, what with everyone kind of sorting each other out, Alia trying to help prove Marinette's innocence, and Natalie being helped by Gabriel in all of her health conditions. But then the cool factor is turned up to 11 when Mayura creates a Sentimonster copy of Ladybug, and I feel like this is where all of the Adrian as a Sentimonster theories started, because Because this was the first episode where they create senti-monsters and they're treated as an actual human being by the cast, Ladybug realizing that the fake Ladybug senti-monster was only acting on orders from Mayura because she was being controlled. And so the Ladybug senti-monster is given her freedom when Ladybug, the actual Ladybug, not the fake Ladybug, gives her her amokized object. And this was a very interesting idea. Do senti-monsters deserve freedom? Sure, we wouldn't really get that idea explored further until Felix in season 5, but I really appreciate them trying to start up the conversation here. After all, setup is really important with these kinds of things. And then right at the end of the episode, Ladybug, Cat Noir, Hawkmoth and Mayura have a stand down, which was really interesting and cool to watch. I mean, I wasn't expecting Hawkmoth himself to show up. He doesn't even fight the actual heroes in Miracle Queen. In fact, I'd argue that this felt more of a season finale than Miracle Queen ever did. But you know what, I've trashed on Miracle Queen enough. We all know it sucks, we all know why, let's just move on with our lives, why don't we? Even though Lila is easily the weakest part of this episode, it doesn't really affect my enjoyment of it too much, because it had me at the edge of my seat the whole time. I honestly feel like Feast was such an amazing, absolutely phenomenal episode, and we needed that more than ever in this slog of a season. Season 3 had so much unnecessary filler that I always adored the more lore-heavy episodes, because they weren't exactly a dime a dozen, were they? And hey look, Mayura's here, so of course it's going to be a great episode. And boy is it great. Master Fu's backstory is fully unveiled to us for the first time. It's been teased ever since the start of Season 2, so naturally there was a lot riding on whether or not this would live up to the hype. And boy did it. Master Fu accidentally killing everybody in his monastery because of a senti-monster of his getting out of control is so dark. When we first saw the senti-monster that would become Feast, it was really scary because Natalie had a physical reaction to its presence. They do a great job of building up this thing as an immense threat despite its small size. And it also lives up to the excitement that was already garnered from this episode alone. Hawkmoth akumatizing the senti-monster to become super huge so it can eat Master Fu and take the miraculouses from him is really cool. And so Ladybug and Cat Noir, without their miraculouses, given the fact that Master Fu took them to protect them, have to save Master Fu from his own creation. Which is just such a unique idea that you don't see in the show very often, if at all. It really showcases Marinette and Adrian's characters in a very amazing way, demonstrating to us that they really care about Master Fu and refuse to give up on him. Plus, this is a bit of a tangent, but I find it so cool that Hawkmoth was able to akumatize the senti-monster. I've always adored learning more about akumatization in general, so getting these little tidbits is much appreciated, if only by me. Plus, Mayura's involvement of this episode was really amazing. Seeing her dedication to helping Hawkmoth out at the expense of her help was really gripping, and it also showcases Hawkmoth's humanity as well. Besides the fact that he's doing it for his wife, he cares about Natalie's health and regrets using her for assistance all the time. And by all the time, I mean only the times when she's Mayura. Which surprisingly is not a lot. They really underutilized Mayura after all of the hype that she got. However, on the positive side, having so few appearances means that every single one means something important. I just feel like they handled it way better in season 4 with Shadow Moth, but that's besides the point. This episode gives me so much to talk about and so much to adore, and it's actually kind of insane. I don't know if I can touch on everything I love about this episode, but I have tried my best. And you know what? It's a very good sign when there's so much to love you can't really express all of it fully. Just like the next episode on the list. What's this? A Chloe redemption arc episode where Chloe isn't completely demonized beyond all human comprehension? One where she actually gets to be a three-dimensional character instead of, in Smarty Pants' words, an angry plot device that only exists to be the most annoying person alive? It's actually pretty surreal. I mean, I've always associated season 3 with Chloe's character development going in the garbage, but it's really easy to forget that only happened right at the end of the season. Chloe was still going strong in the early season episodes, and I feel like this is exemplified best from Miracula. This episode is all about Chloe and how she feels like Queen Bee is being neglected by Ladybug. And it's understandable. After all, Queen Bee is the one bright spot in Chloe's life and it allows her to be a superhero alongside her idol. And it's really heartwarming to see how much faith Chloe puts in Ladybug. However, it's not like Ladybug is unjustified in refusing to give the Bee Miraculous to Chloe. After all, in Queen Wasp, she revealed her identity to everybody in Paris. It would have been too dangerous to keep her on the team because Hawkmoth could just exploit her and put her family in danger future to get something from Ladybug. So it's a pretty interesting dilemma and a very interesting moral conflict, honestly. Is Ladybug wrong for refusing to give Chloe the Bee Miraculous anymore to protect her if it's the only thing that gives Chloe meaning and purpose? Honestly, I can't really say, because it comes from a good place, but it still hurts Chloe a lot. And to be fair, Ladybug is being rather reasonable. Hawkmoth does try to exploit Chloe and her weaknesses to make her join his side, which at the time we thought wouldn't work because we had faith in Astruc's writing decisions. That ship has well and truly sailed, and now I suffer from significant trust issues. Obviously I don't, I'm just joking. Speaking of which, I found it really interesting how Hawkmoth and Mayura tried to exploit Chloe's distrust in Ladybug. They deliberately set up a scenario where Chloe can't be Queen Bee, which destroys Chloe's hope in Ladybug. Still don't really understand why Hawkmoth is so fixated on Chloe of all people when Lila is right there, but I've already gone on at length about that. Besides, it's really interesting to see Chloe actually reject Hawkmoth's offer, showing that she actually has changed somewhat. Chloe literally breaks herself out of an akumatization, which was treated as a really big deal in this episode, as it should. I mean, it definitely looked like it took a lot of effort out of her. I am thoroughly convinced that the reason so many characters were able to break out of akumatization so easily and effortlessly in Season 4 is so Thomas Astruc could claim that Chloe is nothing special. Disappointing. Are we sure that Chloe isn't based on a childhood bully or something? Because he sure does love making her as controversial as possible. Speaking of which, I feel like my number one pick will probably be the most controversial of all. I mean, we all know it. It's the only episode I haven't brought up or talked about yet. So, let's finally do that. Look, I understand that this episode definitely has quite a few dissenters. It's definitely one of the most controversial and divisive episodes in the entire show. But I just can't help but listen to my heart in this case. And what my heart is telling me is that this is my favourite Season 3 episode. Any of the problems that other people have with it are ones that I just don't really care about because they don't take away from my absolute adoration of it. I wonder if this is the episode that most people outside of the fandom know about, because it really was such a fandom breaking episode when it first came out back in November 2019. I mean, it gives us everything we've wanted for years, even if it is just for a fake out, because unlike Ephemeral, this was the first time they did something like this. I appreciated this episode a lot more than Oblivio did because it went all the way with its alternate timeline story. I'm not too bothered about the fact that everything was erased by the end, because what I did see proves that this can't be the timeline we exist in. Everything is just so bleak after Cat Blanc destroys the world. He goes insane from months of loneliness and gripping guilt. And then when he sees Ladybug, he sees this as an opportunity to combine the Ladybug and Cat Miraculouses to make a wish. And that's the thing right there. Cat Blanc is such a unique villain. He doesn't work with Hawkmoth, he works on his own terms to fix his mess in his own twisted way. And oh goodness is he terrifying. I'd argue he's the scariest Miraculous Ladybug villain we've ever got. Seeing his mood swings in front of Ladybug makes him such an unpredictable foe. He's so unnerving and creepy because you don't know just how extreme he's willing to get. I mean, he was going to destroy the entire universe just because of all of his grief compounding in on itself. It's really tragic to see just how deeply traumatized he is, and to notice how the akumatization is influencing and exacerbating this. One of the reasons why I don't mind this episode being a quote-unquote what-if episode is because it actually does have consequences for the future. Marinette still remembers Cat Blanc well into Season 4, and it still influences her decision-making. Plus there's Bunnik seeing how everything led to this point. Through her, we get to see, as an audience, just how everything went wrong in this alternate timeline. And it's really intriguing to watch, considering the fact that we'd never seen any of this in the show before. And even if it's fleeting, that doesn't mean it's fragile. That confrontation scene between Ladybug, Cat Noir, and Hawkmoth in the basement was legendary. We got to see Hawkmoth confront Adrien and vice versa about all of their familial issues and Hawkmoth's insistence that Emily must return. Then he akumatizes Cat Noir with no regard for his own son, and while I find this a bit inconsistent with Hawkmoth's character, I also can't help but feel like there's some poignancy to this moment. The thing is, I'm conflicted because Gabriel should care about his son, and yet his unwavering drive to revive his wife might be conflicting with that. And while that does seem a little bit strange considering the fact that I can't draw a conclusion here or there, do I really need to? Sometimes it's just best to be subtle instead of on the nose. Let the spectacle do the talking for you, which this episode does tremendously. I've never thought this much about these characters as I have with Cat Blanc, but you know what? Maybe that's okay. Even if I won't get answers anytime soon, I won't stop asking these questions, because that's the most important thing to me. The mystery and the intrigue. And isn't that why so many people gravitated towards this episode? I think we all know the answer. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I apologize that it's taken me so long to release another one of these ranking videos, or just a video in general. I've been really busy lately, what with year 13. But I am trying my very best to make uploads at least a little bit more consistent. Anyway, I should probably get to the favorite comment thing, because a lot of you guys really work quite hard on your comments and they deserve some recognition. My favorite comment from the last video was from MG/miraculouslygory. I'm sorry if this is biased, but I really enjoyed the comment he left. You know I'm a massive Harumi fan, I couldn't resist. However, this isn't the only shout out that I'm going to do. I've been requested by a fellow Miraculous Ladybug YouTuber who wants to grow their channel to be shouted out in one of my videos to give them some exposure, which I was more than happy to do. After all, that's what Cyrus did for me way back when. This is the channel Curious Critiques, a fan of mine who also makes video essay/review content. I highly suggest giving him a watch, or at the very least showing him some support by subscribing to his channel. I believe in him. I really appreciate all of the effort that he's putting in, and I do want to see that rewarded. Curious Critiques, if you're watching this outro, I just wanted to say I'm really glad that I could help you and that I was an inspiration to you, and I wish you the best of luck. This has been a critical retrospective, and I'll see you all in the next video essay.